The dust had not yet settled on the road into Prescott, Arizona territory, when Daniel Whitfield first smelled the biscuits. It was the autumn of 1881, and he had ridden 4 days through country that seemed determined to kill any man foolish enough to cross it, chasing a name and a description that had been given to him by a United States marshal in Tucson. He was tired down to his bones. His canteen had run dry since noon, and the paper folded in his breast pocket carried the weight of a promise he had made to bring in a woman accused of murder and theft from a stagecoach line. Susanna Easton, the paper read, 26 years of age. Brown hair, gray eyes, last seen fleeing north from Tombstone after the shooting of a Wells Fargo agent named Cyrus Bell. Daniel had been a deputy marshal for 6 years, and in that time he had arrested men twice his size, men who had killed for far less reason than the woman he now sought was accused of killing for. Yet something about this particular assignment sat wrong in his stomach, though he could not have said why. Perhaps it was that Marshal Cole Hendricks had seemed unusually eager to see the matter closed, or perhaps it was simply the ache of the road working on his nerves. Either way, he pushed the thought aside as he dismounted in front of a modest clapboard house at the edge of town, drawn by the smell of baking bread and something rich with sage and wild onion. A sign nailed to the porch post read simply, "MEALS, 25 cents. He had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and his body made the decision before his mind could catch up to it. He tied his horse to the post, mounted the 2 wooden steps, and knocked. The woman who opened the door wiped flour from her hands onto an apron the color of dried clay, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. She had brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, strands of it escaping to frame a face that was pretty in a plain, sun-worn way, the kind of prettiness that came from work rather than idleness. Her eyes were gray, the color of rain clouds over the Bradshaw Mountains, and they studied him with the particular wariness of someone who had learned not to trust strangers easily. "Are you here for supper, mister, or are you just going to stand there letting the flies in?" Daniel removed his hat, more out of old habit than manners, though manners came into it too. "Supper, ma'am, if you have any to spare. I've been on the road since Tucson. Tucson's a long way." She stepped back to let him in, and something in her voice carried a note of caution, though he did not think much of it at the time. Travelers came through Prescott from every direction, and a woman running a meal house learned to size up strangers quickly. "Sit yourself down. I've got beans, biscuits, and some rabbit stew if you don't mind rabbit." "I don't mind rabbit," he said, and found himself smiling for the first time in days. "I don't mind much of anything right now except an empty stomach." The house was small but clean, with a table that could seat perhaps 6, though only 2 other chairs were occupied that evening, an elderly prospector who ate in silence and a young cowhand who kept glancing toward the woman with an admiration he made no effort to hide. Daniel took a seat near the window, where the last orange light of the day slanted through in long bars, and watched as she moved between the stove and the table with a competence that spoke of long practice. She set a plate before him, the stew steaming, the biscuits split and buttered, and he thanked her with a sincerity that seemed to catch her off guard. "You're kinder than most who come through," she said, and there was something guarded in the observation, as though kindness were a thing she had learned to be suspicious of. "I've been raised to mind my manners," Daniel said. "My mother would have taken a switch to me otherwise, God rest her." "Is she passed, then?" "Some years back. Consumption." He did not know why he told her that, a stranger in a meal house he would likely never visit again, except that there was something in her manner that invited a person to speak plainly. "And your folks, ma'am, are they hereabouts?" A shadow crossed her face, quick as a bird's wing. "My father passed as well. My mother lives back east. I came out this way some years ago." She did not elaborate, and he did not press, though the deputy marshal in him noted the evasion the way he noted everything, filing it away without conscious intention. "Name's Daniel Whitfield," he offered, extending a hand. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before taking it, her grip firm despite the flour still clinging faintly to her fingers. "Susanna," she said. "Susanna Easton." If Daniel's expression changed at all, he did not let it show, though inside him something dropped away like a man missing a step in the dark. He had been looking for this woman for 4 days, carrying her description folded against his chest, and here she was setting a plate of rabbit stew before him with hands that trembled only slightly. Hands that, according to the paper in his pocket, had drawn a pistol against a Wells Fargo agent and left him bleeding in the dust outside Tombstone. He finished his meal because his body demanded it, and because he needed the time to think, and all the while he watched her without watching her, the way a man learns to watch a deer he does not wish to spook. She did not carry herself like a killer. She laughed once softly, when the old prospector made some dry joke about his mule, and the sound of it was warm and unguarded, nothing like the description of a hardened outlaw that had been relayed to him by men who had never met her. When the meal was finished and the other diners had gone, he lingered, ostensibly over a second cup of coffee, though in truth he was turning over in his mind what he ought to do. He could arrest her now this very evening, put her in irons and deliver her to the town marshal for holding until transport could be arranged to Tombstone for trial. It was what his commission demanded of him. It was, in the plainest terms, his duty, and yet he did not move. "You're staring, Mr. Whitfield," Susanna said, not unkindly as she gathered his empty plate. "Forgive me. I suppose I'm tired enough that my manners have gone soft at the edges. There's a boarding house 2 streets over if you're needing a bed. Mrs. Kellerman runs it fair and she doesn't charge extra for a bath. I appreciate that." He rose, placed coins on the table for the meal, and found himself saying, before he had quite decided to say it, "I expect I'll be in Prescott a few days yet. Would it trouble you if I came back for supper tomorrow?" Something flickered in her gray eyes, surprise perhaps, or something warmer that she did not allow herself to examine too closely. "It wouldn't trouble me at all," she said. "I feed anyone who's hungry and has a quarter to spare." He left her house that evening with his stomach full and his mind in turmoil, and he did not sleep well at the boarding house, turning the matter over and over as the desert wind rattled the shutters. He had been sent to arrest a murderer, and he had found a woman who fed strangers with her own hands and laughed at an old man's jokes about his mule. The two things did not fit together, and Daniel Whitfield was not a man who could rest easy with pieces that did not fit. The next morning he rode to the small office of the Prescott town marshal, a heavy-set man named Orrin Fletcher who had held the post for a decade and knew every soul within 20 miles. "Whitfield," Fletcher said, looking up from a stack of papers. "Heard you rode in yesterday. What brings a deputy marshal all the way from Tucson?" "I'm looking into the matter of the Wells Fargo shooting outside Tombstone this past summer," Daniel said carefully. "The woman named in the warrant is Susanna Easton. I understand she may have settled here in Prescott." Fletcher's brow furrowed and he set down his pen. "Susanna runs the meal house on Willow Street. That's the one. Whitfield, I'll tell you plain, I've known that woman 2 years and she hasn't so much as raised her voice at a drunk who wandered into her kitchen looking for trouble. You're certain you've got the right Susanna Easton? The description matches. Brown hair, gray eyes, about the right age, and she confirmed the name herself without prompting." Fletcher rubbed his jaw. "Well, matching a description doesn't make a woman a murderer. Half the women in this territory have brown hair and gray eyes." He paused. "Have you spoken to her about the incident itself?" "Not yet. Might be worth doing before you go clapping irons on a woman who feeds half this town on credit when times are lean." Fletcher's tone was mild, but there was a warning in it, the kind one lawman gives another when he suspects a mistake is being made. "I'd want more than a warrant before I did something I couldn't undo." Daniel thanked him and rode back into town with those words echoing in his mind. He was a careful man by nature, not given to rash action, and Fletcher's caution only confirmed what his own instincts had already been whispering. He would need to know more before he acted, and there was only one way to learn more. He returned to Susanna's meal house that evening, and the evening after that, and by the fourth visit he had become such a fixture at her table that she began setting his plate down before he even asked, and the old prospector had started calling him the marshal's boy with a wink, not knowing how close to the truth the jest ran. It was on the fifth evening, when the last customer had gone, and the kitchen had grown quiet except for the crackle of the stove, that Daniel finally found the courage, or perhaps the necessity, to ask the question that had been sitting in his chest like a stone. "Susanna," he said, and she looked up from where she was scrubbing a pot, something in his tone catching her attention. "I need to ask you about Tombstone." The color left her face so quickly that he thought for a moment she might faint. She set the pot down with a clatter and gripped the edge of the wash basin, her knuckles white. "Why do you ask me that?" Her voice had gone thin. "Because I have a warrant for your arrest," he said, and there was no way to say it gently, though he tried. "For the shooting of Cyrus Bell, a Wells Fargo agent, this past July. I was sent from Tucson to find you and bring you back." For a long moment she said nothing at all, and he watched her chest rise and fall in quick, shallow breaths, watched her gray eyes fill with something that was not quite fear and not quite anger but a terrible mixture of both. "Then why haven't you arrested me?" she asked finally, her voice low and trembling. "You've had 5 days." "Because I don't believe you're the woman that warrant describes," Daniel said. "Not the way it describes her, and I want to hear the truth from you before I do anything else." Susanna sank into a chair at the table, her hands twisting in her apron, and for the first time since he had met her, the composure that seemed so natural to her cracked entirely, revealing something raw and frightened beneath. "Cyrus Bell was my husband's business partner," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband, Thomas, worked for Wells Fargo as a shotgun guard on the stage line. Bell handled the money at the Tombstone office. 3 months before the shooting, Thomas discovered that Bell had been skimming from the strongbox, small amounts at first, then larger ones, and covering the losses by blaming holdups that never happened." Daniel sat across from her, his coffee forgotten, listening with the full attention of a man who had learned to hear the truth in a voice even when the words themselves came haltingly. "Thomas confronted him," Susanna continued. "Bell laughed it off, said no one would believe a guard's word against an agent's, and he was likely right about that. But then 2 weeks later Thomas was killed. Officially it was called a holdup gone wrong, out on the Benson Road. No witnesses. No money taken, though, which struck me as strange even then, because why would robbers kill a man and leave the strongbox untouched? You believed Bell had him killed." "I knew it," she said, and there was iron in her voice now beneath the grief. "I went to Bell myself foolishly and told him I knew what he'd done. He didn't deny it outright, but he smiled at me in a way that told me everything. He told me I'd best keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep breathing." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, angry at the tears that came despite her effort to hold them back. "A week later he came to my house at night. He'd been drinking. He said things, tried to force himself on me, and when I fought him he drew a pistol. We struggled for it. It went off. He fell, and he did not get up again." Daniel's jaw had tightened as she spoke, a cold fury rising in him that he had to consciously set aside in order to keep his voice steady. "And no one saw this happen. No one but God," Susanna said. "I ran. I knew what would happen if I stayed. A woman with no proof against a respected agent of Wells Fargo, and Bell's friends in that town were the sort who could make a jury believe whatever suited them. I took what little money I had and I rode north, and I did not stop until I reached Prescott, and here I have stayed, cooking meals and trying to forget what I left behind." The kitchen was silent except for the soft ticking of the stove as it cooled. Daniel studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, and found none, only exhaustion and grief and a fear that had clearly been living inside her for months, coiled tight as a snake ready to strike. "I believe you," he said finally. Susanna looked up, startled. "You believe me?" "I've sat across tables from liars, Susanna. I've learned the sound of it, the way their eyes move, the way their stories shift when you press them from a different angle. You haven't lied to me, not once." He reached across the table, hesitated, then covered her trembling hand with his own, a gesture that surprised them both. But belief doesn't undo a warrant. If I ride back to Tucson and tell Marshal Hendricks I found you and let you go because I believed your story, he'll send another man, and that man may not care to hear it. Then what do I do? Her voice cracked on the question, and it was the first time he had heard true despair in it. We need proof, Daniel said. Something beyond your word. Did Belle keep records, ledgers, anything that might show the skimming your husband discovered? Thomas kept a small notebook, Susanna said slowly, as though the memory were only now surfacing. He wrote down dates and amounts, times Belle had reported holdups that I know for certain never happened, because Thomas rode guard on those very routes and nothing occurred. He hid it before he died, afraid of what might happen if Belle found it. Where? I don't know. He never told me exactly, only that it was safe, in a place Belle would never think to look. She pressed her fingers to her temples. I've thought of little else these past months, wondering if I should have searched harder before I fled, but I was so afraid, Daniel. I only wanted to live. It was the first time she had used his given name, and something in the sound of it, spoken with such raw vulnerability, settled deep into his chest and lodged there. Then we'll find it, he said, with a certainty he did not entirely feel but wished fervently to be true. But it will mean going back to Tombstone. Susanna's eyes widened with fear. If I go back there, Belle's friends will see me arrested the moment I set foot in town, warrant or no explanation. Not if you're already under arrest, Daniel said slowly, an idea forming even as he spoke it. Not if I bring you in myself as my prisoner, with the appearance of having captured you fairly. No one will move against a deputy marshal's custody without cause, and it will give us the chance to search for that notebook before any trial can be arranged. You would do that, risk your position, perhaps your life, to help me. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, at the flower still faintly dusting her forearms, at the gray eyes that had seen more grief in a year than most saw in a lifetime, and he felt something settle inside him with the quiet finality of a decision already made in some deeper part of himself days ago. Perhaps the very evening he had smelled her biscuits from the road and felt his tired heart lift for the first time in weeks. I would, he said simply. I don't fully understand it myself, Susanna, but I know I am not riding away from this table and forgetting what I've heard tonight. I became a lawman because I believed the law was meant to protect the innocent, not simply to punish whoever wears the label of guilty most conveniently. If that means bending the manner of your arrest to serve justice rather than expedience, then I will bend it. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks now, and she did not try to hide them. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said gently. We've a long road ahead and a dangerous one, but we'll ride it together. They departed Prescott 3 days later. Once Daniel had quietly arranged for a trusted neighbor to look after Susanna's meal house in her absence, telling curious neighbors only that the marshal's business had called her away briefly, and she would return. The lie sat uneasily with Susanna, who had built a life in Prescott on honesty and hard work, but she understood the necessity of it. They rode south through country that grew progressively harsher, the green hills around Prescott giving way to the reddish rock and scrub of the desert proper, saguaro standing sentinel against skies of an almost impossible blue. Daniel had procured a set of light manacles for appearance's sake, though he never once fastened them to her wrists, except when passing through towns where curious eyes might notice a deputy marshal traveling with an unrestrained female prisoner. I feel a fraud, Susanna admitted on the second night of their journey, as they sat by a small fire she had built with practiced efficiency, having grown up on a homestead before her marriage. Riding along as though I am your captive when in truth you have shown me nothing but kindness. You are my prisoner in the eyes of the law, Daniel said, turning a piece of jerky over the flame. That much is true enough. What is also true is that I intend to see you cleared of these charges, whatever it takes, because I have come to believe with my whole heart that you deserve to live free of this fear that has been chasing you. Why? She asked, and the question was not accusatory but genuinely curious, as though she could not fathom what had drawn a stranger to risk so much on her behalf. Daniel considered his answer carefully before speaking. "Because in 6 years of this work, I have arrested men I knew to be guilty, and felt no more than the satisfaction of duty done. And I have sat at your table for 5 evenings and felt something I have not felt in a very long time, perhaps ever. I don't know precisely what to call it yet, Susanna, but I know it is not the sort of thing a man walks away from without trying to understand it first." She was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across her face, and when she spoke again her voice was softer than he had yet heard it. "I have not allowed myself to feel much of anything these past months, Daniel. Fear has occupied most of the space in my heart where other things might have grown. But I will admit, since you have been so honest with me, that your kindness has stirred something in me too, something I had thought Thomas's death had buried for good." Neither of them said more that night, but something had shifted between them, an understanding unspoken but felt keenly by them both, and they rode the following days in a companionable silence, occasionally broken by conversation that ranged from her childhood on a Missouri farm to his years growing up the son of a blacksmith in Kansas. And by the time the walls of Tombstone rose against the horizon on the 5th day, Daniel Whitfield knew with absolute certainty that whatever became of the warrant and the trial and the search for a dead man's notebook, he had fallen in love with the woman riding beside him, and he suspected, from certain glances and certain silences, that she had fallen for him in turn. Tombstone in 1881 was a town still riding the wave of silver money that had built it from nothing in the space of a few short years, its main street crowded with freight wagons, its saloons never fully quiet even at midday. Daniel had arranged, through a telegram sent ahead from a way station, for Susanna to be held not in the town jail itself, but in the custody of a deputy he trusted, a young man named Ezra Combs who owed Daniel a debt from an incident some years back involving a horse thief and a case of mistaken identity that Daniel had cleared up before it cost Ezra his position. "You're certain about this, Marshal Whitfield?" Ezra asked quietly, as Susanna was settled into a small room at the back of his own modest house rather than the town jail proper. "If word gets out you're keeping her outside the regular cells, there'll be talk." "There'll be talk regardless," Daniel said. "But I need time to investigate before any hearing is arranged, and I'd rather she be safe than convenient." He pressed a few coins into Ezra's palm, more out of habit than necessity given their history. "Keep her comfortable and keep your mouth shut about the particulars, and I'll see you're not troubled by it." With Susanna settled, Daniel turned his attention to the matter of the notebook. Began, as any careful investigator would, at the Wells Fargo office itself, where Cyrus Bell's former desk still sat, occupied now by a nervous young clerk named Whitmore who had inherited the position and clearly wished he had not. "Bell's things," Whitmore said when Daniel inquired. "Most everything was sent to his family back in Ohio after what happened, sir. There wasn't much left behind. A few papers in the desk, nothing of consequence, mostly old requisition forms." "Did Thomas Easton have a locker here, or any place he might have kept personal effects?" Whitmore's brow furrowed in thought. "The guards keep their gear in the back room, sir, near the stable. There's a row of lockers there. I believe Mr. Easton's things were cleared out after his death, given to his widow, though I couldn't say for certain what became of them." Susanna, when Daniel relayed this to her that evening, shook her head slowly. "Thomas's things were sent to me, yes, but I searched them thoroughly before I fled. There was nothing beyond his clothing, his old rifle, a few letters. No notebook." "Then perhaps he did not keep it among his personal effects at all," Daniel mused, pacing the small room where she was held. "You said he told you it was safe, in a place Bell would never think to look. Bell was a man of the office, of ledgers and counting rooms. Perhaps Thomas hid it somewhere outside that world entirely." Susanna's eyes widened suddenly. "The stable," she said. Thomas loved his horse more than nearly anything else in this world, a old gelding named Samson. He used to say Samson was the only creature in Tombstone he trusted with his secrets. She laughed softly, though the sound carried more grief than mirth. I thought it was simply a fond joke between a man and his horse, but what if he meant it more literally? Is Samson still alive? Still in Tombstone. He was boarded at the livery on Fremont Street when I left. I don't know if he's been sold since. The livery, when Daniel visited it the following morning under the pretense of arranging stabling for his own horse, still housed the aging gelding, now cared for by the stable owner who had taken pity on the animal after no buyer came forward following his master's death. Samson, you say? The stable owner, a weathered man named Curtis, said when Daniel inquired about the horse's history. Yes, he was Easton's horse, the guard who was killed out on the Benson Road. Poor fellow's gotten old and stiff, but I keep him fed. Didn't seem right to turn him loose or sell him for what little he'd fetch. Would you object if I examined his saddle and tack? A matter connected to the investigation into his former owner's death. Curtis shrugged. Don't see why not. It's all hanging right there in the tack room, hasn't been touched in months. Daniel searched the old saddle with careful hands, running his fingers along the seams, checking beneath the fleece lining, and finding nothing until he came to the saddlebags themselves, worn leather pouches that had clearly seen years of hard use. In the bottom of the second bag, beneath a false leather panel that had been stitched in with careful, deliberate craftsmanship, his fingers found the edge of something firm and rectangular. He drew out a small, water-stained notebook, its pages soft with age and handling, and his heart quickened as he opened it to find columns of careful handwriting, dates and figures, notations that even a cursory glance revealed to be a detailed record of discrepancies in the Wells Fargo Strongbox reports. Cross-referenced against the actual routes, Thomas Easton himself had ridden guard on the very dates in question. He closed the notebook carefully, his hands trembling slightly with the significance of what he held, and thanked Curtis before riding directly back to Ezra Combs's house, where Susanna waited. "Susanna," he said, breathless from the ride, "I found it." She rose from her chair so quickly it nearly toppled, and when he placed the notebook in her hands and watched her leaf through the pages, recognition and grief and a fierce, rising hope all crossing her face in quick succession, he felt his own heart swell with something close to triumph. "This is it," she whispered. "This is exactly what he told me about." Dates when Bell reported holdups on the Benson and Charleston roads, robberies that never happened, because Thomas himself rode those very roads on those very days without incident. She looked up at Daniel, her gray eyes bright with tears. "This proves the pattern, Daniel. It proves Bell had reason to want Thomas silenced, and it makes my account of what happened the night he came to my house far more believable. It's not final proof of what happened between you and Bell that night," Daniel said carefully, "but it establishes motive, and it establishes that Bell was a man capable of far more than simple theft. Combined with your own testimony, and the fact that there were no witnesses to contradict your account, I believe a fair judge would see reasonable doubt in any charge of murder." "But will the judge in Tombstone be fair?" Susanna asked, the old fear creeping back into her voice. "You said yourself that Bell had friends here." Daniel's jaw set with determination. "Then we will need more than the notebook alone. We will need to find others who might corroborate the pattern of theft, or who witnessed Bell's character in ways that support your account of his behavior that night." It was at this point that fortune, or perhaps simple providence, intervened in the form of a woman named Louisa Hargrove, a laundress who had done washing for the Wells Fargo office for several years, and who, upon hearing through the grapevine of gossip that always ran thick in a town like Tombstone that questions were being asked about Cyrus Bell, approached Daniel directly one evening as he left the telegraph office. "You're the marshal asking about Bell," she said, without preamble, a woman perhaps 40 years of age with tired eyes and capable hands roughened by years of hard labor. I heard you're looking into what happened with Easton's widow. I am, Daniel said carefully. Do you have information relevant to the matter, Mrs. Hargrove? I did washing for the office for 3 years, Louisa said, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. I saw things a laundress isn't supposed to see, mister. Papers left in coat pockets, that sort of thing. Bell was a man who liked his liquor and liked to talk when he'd had too much of it. More than once I heard him boasting to other men about how easy it was to skim from a strongbox when a man controlled the reporting himself, laughing about how no guard would ever think to question an agent's word. She hesitated. And I'll tell you something else, mister, since you're asking. Bell had a reputation with women that wasn't fit for polite conversation. More than one girl in this town could tell you stories about him that would turn your stomach, if they weren't too frightened of what his friends might do to speak of it. Would you be willing to testify to what you've told me if a hearing were arranged? Louisa's face tightened with fear, but after a long moment she nodded slowly. Easton's widow always seemed a decent, hard-working woman to me, whatever else folks might say. If she's in trouble on account of that man, I'll speak what I know. Someone ought to, before he causes harm to another poor soul from beyond the grave, so to speak. With the notebook and Louisa Hargrove's testimony in hand, Daniel felt the ground beneath their case grow considerably more solid, and he arranged, through contacts he maintained with the territorial court, for a formal hearing to be scheduled before a circuit judge known for his fairness, a man named Judge Alden Pierce, who traveled a regular circuit through the Southern Territory, and was due to pass through Tombstone within the fortnight. The 2 weeks that followed were among the most trying, and yet, paradoxically, the most tender of Daniel Whitfield's life. By day he worked tirelessly to build the case, tracking down additional witnesses, corroborating dates and figures in the notebook against official Wells Fargo records that Whitmore, once convinced of the seriousness of the matter, reluctantly allowed him to examine. By evening he returned to the small room where Susanna was held, and their conversations, which had begun as necessary discussions of strategy and evidence, gradually deepened into something far more personal. "Tell me about your husband," Daniel said one evening, as they sat together while Ezra's wife, a kind woman named Bessie, prepared a simple supper in the next room. "I want to understand the man you loved, if you're willing to speak of him." Susanna's expression softened with memory. "Thomas was steady," she said. "Not given to grand gestures or fine words, but honest through and through, and gentle in a way that surprised people who expected a shotgun guard to be rough around the edges. We married young before we came west, back in Missouri. He always dreamed of owning land of his own someday, enough to run cattle and raise a family away from the dangers of the stage line." She smiled faintly. "We never got the chance to see that dream through." "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly, "for everything that was taken from you." "You've given me a chance to reclaim some of it," she said, looking at him with an openness that made his chest tighten. "I did not expect, when you knocked on my door that first evening smelling of trail dust and looking half-starved, that you would become the person who helped me find my way back to some measure of peace. I did not expect, when I smelled biscuits baking from the road, that I would find myself falling in love with the very woman I had been sent to arrest," Daniel admitted, the words leaving him before he had fully decided to speak them, though he did not regret them once they were said. Susanna's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the small room filled with a silence that hummed with unspoken feeling. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have been afraid to name what I feel, given everything hanging over us, the uncertainty of the hearing, the danger we've both taken on. But I would be lying to you and to myself if I did not say that I have come to love you too, more fully and more quickly than I ever thought possible after losing Thomas." He reached for her hand, and this time there was nothing hesitant in the gesture, nothing of duty or investigation. He simply held her hand in both of his, feeling the roughness of her palms from years of honest work, and brought it to his lips. "Then whatever the judge decides," he said, "know that I am not walking away from you, Susanna Easton. Not now, not ever." "Even if the hearing goes against me," she asked, fear flickering behind the hope in her eyes. "Even if I am found guilty and sent to prison or worse." "It will not come to that," Daniel said, with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I will move heaven and earth before I let that happen. But even in the darkest circumstance you can imagine, I would wait for you, Susanna, however long it took." She wept then, but they were not tears of despair. And when he gathered her into his arms and held her against his chest, feeling her breathing slowly steady, he understood with complete clarity that whatever else happened in the days ahead, his life had been irrevocably and wonderfully altered by a woman who had come into it through the strangest of circumstances. A warrant meant to bring her to justice becoming instead the very thing that had brought them together. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and bright. The kind of crisp autumn morning that seemed almost mockingly cheerful given the gravity of what was to unfold within the walls of the small tombstone courthouse. Daniel had spent the previous evening reviewing every piece of evidence with the meticulous care of a man who understood that a single overlooked detail could mean the difference between justice and tragedy. Judge Alden Pierce was a man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of frontier justice, both fair and unjust, to have developed a healthy skepticism toward easy conclusions. He listened without expression as the prosecuting attorney, a young man from the county seat named Harlan Voss, who clearly had ambitions beyond his current station, and saw the trial as an opportunity to prove his mettle, laid out the case against Susanna Easton in stark terms. The defendant did willfully and with malice shoot and kill Cyrus Bell, a respected agent of the Wells Fargo Company, Voss declared, pacing before the small assembly of townspeople who had gathered to observe the proceedings, drawn by curiosity and the particular hunger that small towns developed for scandal and spectacle. She fled the scene rather than reporting the incident to proper authorities, a clear indication of guilt, and evaded capture for months before finally being apprehended by Deputy Marshal Whitfield. When it came time for the defense, Daniel had insisted on presenting the evidence himself, given his standing as the arresting officer and his intimate knowledge of the investigation, though Susanna would also be given the opportunity to speak in her own defense. "Your Honor," Daniel began, standing before the judge with the notebook in hand, "I ask the court to consider not simply the fact of Cyrus Bell's death, but the full circumstances surrounding it, circumstances that paint a picture far more complex than my esteemed colleague has suggested." He presented the notebook, walking the judge through Thomas Easton's careful documentation of discrepancies in the strongbox reports, cross-referenced against dates the guard himself had written without incident. He called Whitmore to testify to the authenticity of the Wells Fargo records that corroborated these discrepancies. He called Louisa Hargrove, who, despite her evident nervousness at speaking in a public courtroom, gave her testimony regarding Bell's boasts of skimming and his troubling reputation with women in a clear, steady voice that carried the weight of long-suppressed conviction. "This establishes a clear motive," Daniel argued, "for Cyrus Bell to have wished harm upon Thomas Easton, who discovered his theft, and subsequently upon Susanna Easton, who confronted him about her husband's suspicious death. The defendant did not seek out a confrontation with Bell on the night in question. By her own sworn account, which I ask the court to hear directly, Bell came to her home uninvited, in a state of intoxication, and made unwelcome advances that escalated into physical violence, during which a struggle over his own weapon resulted in his death." When Susanna took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, recounting the terror of that night, the desperate strength born of fighting for her own survival, her composure grew steadier, lent strength by the truth of her own words and by the sight of Daniel watching her from across the courtroom with unwavering faith in his eyes. "I did not go to that man's office seeking violence," she said, addressing the judge directly. "I went seeking only the truth about my husband's death, and justice for a wrong I could see clearly even if I could not yet prove it. What happened that night was not of my choosing. I fought for my life, Your Honor, nothing more, and I have carried the weight of that night with me every single day since, wondering if I might have done something differently, wishing with all my heart that it had never come to pass. But I will not apologize for surviving." Harlan Voss attempted to poke holes in her account, suggesting that a woman alone could not have overpowered a grown man without premeditation. But Daniel had anticipated this line of attack and called upon a doctor from Prescott who had, at Daniel's earlier request, examined old records from Tombstone's own physician regarding the nature of Bell's fatal wound. Testimony that confirmed the trajectory and circumstances were entirely consistent with a struggle rather than a deliberate, calculated shooting. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Pierce retired to consider the evidence, a silence that stretched for what felt to Daniel like hours, though it was in truth perhaps 40 minutes. When the judge returned, his expression remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing of his conclusions. "This court has heard evidence," Judge Pierce began, "that paints a picture considerably more nuanced than a simple case of murder for gain or malice. The documentation provided by the late Thomas Easton, corroborated by official company records, establishes a clear and troubling pattern of theft and deception on the part of the deceased, Cyrus Bell. The testimony of Mrs. Hargrove, while circumstantial regarding the specific events of the night in question, speaks to a character entirely consistent with the defendant's account of unwelcome and violent advances." He paused, looking directly at Susanna, who sat with her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. "It is the finding of this court," he continued, "that the death of Cyrus Bell occurred in the course of the defendant defending herself against violent assault, and does not constitute murder under the laws of this territory. The charges against Susanna Easton are hereby dismissed, and she is free to go, with the full recognition of this court that a grave injustice was nearly done to her through months of undeserved fear and flight, injustice compounded by the failure of proper authorities to investigate the full circumstances of Thomas Easton's death at the time it originally occurred." The courtroom erupted into a murmur of reaction, some townspeople nodding with evident satisfaction, others clearly disappointed at being denied a more dramatic conclusion to the spectacle. But Daniel heard none of it, his attention fixed entirely on Susanna, who had gone very still, as though she could not quite believe what she had heard. Then the stillness broke, and she was moving toward him, and he was moving toward her, and when they met in the center aisle of that small courtroom, heedless of the eyes upon them, he swept her into his arms and held her as she wept openly, tears of relief and vindication and a joy so profound, it seemed almost too large for her body to contain. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "Daniel, it's truly over." "It's over," he confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "You're free, Susanna, free to live your life without this fear hanging over you any longer." They remained in Tombstone only long enough to settle a few final matters, including a brief but meaningful visit to the small cemetery on the edge of town, where Susanna knelt at her first husband's grave and spoke words of gratitude for the careful record he had kept, the quiet act of a dying man's foresight that had, months later, saved his widow's life and freedom. "You did this, Thomas," she said softly, placing a small bundle of desert wildflowers on the modest headstone. "Your notebook, your love of that old horse and his hiding places. You saved me even after you were gone. I will carry you with me always, but I believe you would want me to live fully, to find happiness again if I could." She glanced back to where Daniel waited a respectful distance away, giving her privacy for this farewell. "I believe I have found a good man, Thomas. I believe you would have liked him." Daniel, when she rejoined him, said nothing of what he might have overheard, only took her hand gently in his own, and together they walked back toward the town, toward whatever future now lay open before them, unburdened at last of the warrant and the fear that had shadowed every step of their journey together. The ride back to Prescott felt entirely different from the journey south. Where before there had been tension coiled beneath every mile, manacles carried more for appearance than necessity, careful watchfulness against the possibility of discovery. Now there was only the easy companionship of two people who had weathered a storm together and emerged, improbably, in love. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked, as they made camp on the second evening, the fire crackling between them beneath a sky thick with stars that seemed, in the vast emptiness of the desert, close enough to touch. "I suppose I shall return to my meal house," Susanna said, though there was a question in her tone, as though she were testing the shape of the future rather than declaring it with certainty. "Cook for travelers, keep my small life in Prescott. It's a good life, Daniel, even if it's a simple one." And what if a certain deputy marshal found himself less inclined to return to the endless riding of his current position? Daniel said carefully. What if he found himself wishing instead to settle somewhere, to build something more permanent than a life spent chasing warrants across the territory? Susanna's eyes searched his face in the firelight. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Daniel Whitfield?" "I am asking," he said, taking her hands in his heart pounding with a nervousness that felt entirely foreign to a man who had faced down armed outlaws without flinching, "whether you might consider building that permanent life with me. I have some savings set aside from years of steady work, enough perhaps to purchase a small piece of land near Prescott, enough to raise cattle or crops, or simply enough to build a proper house where your meal house might grow into something even finer, with two hands to run it instead of one. Are you proposing marriage to me, sitting here in the middle of the desert with dust on your boots and no ring to offer?" she asked, though there was no mockery in the question, only a trembling hope that mirrored his own. "I confess I hadn't the foresight to purchase a ring before we left Tombstone," Daniel admitted, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "My mind was rather occupied with other matters, namely keeping the woman I love from being wrongly convicted of murder. But if you'll have me, Susanna Easton, ring or no ring, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making up for the lack of one, and for every other shortcoming you might discover in me as the years pass." Susanna laughed, a sound of pure, unguarded joy that seemed to Daniel the most beautiful thing he had ever heard, and then she was kissing him, there beside the small fire beneath the vast desert sky, and when at last they drew apart she pressed her forehead against his and whispered, "Yes, Daniel. Yes, I will marry you. I loved you before I fully understood what love was asking of me, and I do not intend to spend one more day denying it." They were married 3 weeks later in Prescott, in a small ceremony held in the front yard of Susanna's meal house, attended by the handful of townspeople who had come to know and respect her over her years there, including Marshal Fletcher, who stood as a witness with evident satisfaction, having quietly suspected from the start that Daniel's interest in the meal house keeper had been rather more personal than professional necessity required. Daniel resigned his commission as deputy marshal shortly after the wedding, a decision that did not come without some regret, given the years of service he had rendered and the sense of purpose the work had given him, but which he made with a clear conscience, understanding that the life he wished to build now required a different kind of presence, one rooted in a single place rather than scattered across the endless roads of the territory. With his savings, supplemented by a modest inheritance from his late father that he had never before had reason to claim, Daniel purchased 40 acres of land a few miles outside Prescott, along a stretch of creek that provided reliable water even through the dry months of summer. Together, he and Susanna built a proper house, larger than her original meal house, with a kitchen designed to her exact specifications, and a wide porch where travelers could rest before continuing their journeys, for she insisted on continuing to feed those who passed through, unwilling to abandon the small kindness that had, after all, been the very thing that had brought her and Daniel together in the first place. The meal house, now doubled in size and staffed by Susanna, along with a young woman named Rosa whom she hired from a nearby ranch to help with the growing business, became something of a local institution over the following years, known throughout the region for the quality of its cooking and the warmth of its welcome, a reputation that Susanna cultivated with the same care she had once used to hide her own fear behind a mask of competent hospitality, except now there was no fear left to hide, only genuine warmth freely given. Daniel, for his part, took to ranching with the same steady dedication he had once brought to law enforcement, building a small herd of cattle that grew over the years into a modest but respectable operation. He never entirely left behind the instincts of his former profession, and on more than one occasion the new town marshal in Prescott, a younger man who had taken Fletcher's position after his retirement, sought Daniel's counsel on difficult cases, respecting the judgment of a man who had once demonstrated such unusual care in weighing the true nature of justice against the simple letter of the law. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after the husband Susanna had lost, was born in the autumn of 1882, nearly a year to the day after Daniel had first knocked on the door of her meal house smelling of trail dust and hunger. Daniel held the boy in his arms on the porch of their home that evening, watching the sunset paint the Bradshaw Mountains in shades of amber and rose, and felt a contentment so complete it nearly overwhelmed him. "He has your eyes," Susanna said softly, joining him on the porch despite the midwife's insistence that she rest, too eager to see her husband and son together to remain confined to bed a moment longer than necessary. "He has your stubbornness already," Daniel replied, laughing as the infant squirmed and fussed at being held in a manner not entirely to his liking. "I dare say he'll give us both plenty to manage in the years ahead." 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace in recognition, Susanna said, of the grace that had carried her through the darkest period of her life and delivered her, against all reasonable expectation, into a happiness she had once believed lost to her forever. Grace grew to have her mother's gray eyes and her father's steady, patient temperament, a combination that made her, from an early age, something of a peacemaker among the children of the surrounding ranches, a role she seemed to relish even as a small girl. Life on the ranch was not without its hardships, of course, for the frontier offered no one an existence entirely free of struggle. There were years of drought that tested the limits of their herd and their patience. A bad winter in 1886 that claimed several head of cattle and required careful management of their remaining resources to see the family through until spring. There was an incident, some years into their marriage, when a group of cattle rustlers operating in the region attempted to make off with a portion of Daniel's herd, and his old instincts as a lawman served him well in tracking the culprits and recovering the stolen animals with the help of the local marshal, though he was careful, in the retelling of the tale to his children years later, to emphasize caution and cooperation with proper authorities over any romanticized notion of taking justice into one's own hands. But through every hardship, Daniel and Susanna faced the challenges together. Their partnership deepened rather than diminished by the passage of years, and the meal house continued to flourish, becoming a gathering place not only for travelers but for the community itself, hosting church socials and town meetings, and on one memorable occasion, the wedding celebration of young Rosa, who had grown from a hired helper into something like a member of the family over the years she worked alongside Susanna. It was on a warm evening in the spring of 1889, nearly 8 years after Daniel had first ridden into Prescott chasing a warrant that would upend and ultimately transform his entire life, that he found himself sitting on the familiar porch of their home, watching his son Thomas, now 7 years old, attempt to teach his younger sister Grace how to properly toss a lasso, using a length of rope far too large for either of their small hands, while a third child, An infant daughter named Eleanor, born just months earlier, slept peacefully in Susanna's arms as she rocked gently in the chair beside him. "Do you ever think back on it?" Susanna asked quietly, watching their children with the soft, contented expression that had become so familiar to Daniel over the years, a far cry from the guarded wariness he had first encountered at her door. "That first evening, when you rode up looking for a murderer and found instead a woman serving rabbit stew." "Every day," Daniel admitted, reaching over to take her hand, the same gesture he had made so many times over the years, though it had never once lost its power to make his heart quicken slightly. "I think of how close I came to simply following my orders without question, to arresting you that very first evening and never learning the truth of what had happened to you. I think of how different both our lives would have been. But you didn't," Susanna said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You looked past the warrant and saw the person, and you gave me the chance to prove that the truth mattered more than convenience or expedience. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, Daniel, greater even than the love you've shown me every day since." "I only did what seemed right," Daniel said softly. "Though I confess my judgment may have been somewhat clouded by the rather extraordinary quality of your cooking." Susanna laughed, the sound carrying across the yard where their children played, drawing a curious glance from young Thomas before he returned his attention to his sister's clumsy attempts at roping an old fence post. "I suppose we ought to thank Marshal Hendricks then," she said, "for sending you on that particular assignment, however misguided his original intentions may have been." "I did hear, some years back, that Hendricks eventually learned the full truth of what had transpired in Tombstone," Daniel said. "I believe it troubled him somewhat, to have so nearly sent an innocent woman to trial without proper investigation. I like to think it made him a more careful marshal in the years since, more willing to question the easy assumption of guilt. Then perhaps some good came of it beyond our own happiness," Susanna said. "Perhaps other travelers on the wrong end of an unjust warrant have benefited from whatever lesson Hendricks took from our story." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in the familiar palette of orange and violet that Daniel had come, over the years, to associate entirely with home, with the particular quality of peace he had found in this place, with this woman, that he had never known during all his years of restless travel across the territory in service of a badge that, however honorably worn, had never given him the sense of belonging he found now in the simple act of watching his children play in the yard of a home he had built with his own hands, beside a woman he had once been sent to arrest and had instead chosen, with his whole heart, to marry. "Supper will be ready soon," Susanna said eventually, rising carefully so as not to disturb the sleeping Eleanor in her arms. "I made your favorite since you mentioned this morning you've been thinking of it." "Rabbit stew?" Daniel asked, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "Rabbit stew," Susanna confirmed, "and biscuits, of course. Some traditions are worth preserving, don't you think, even after all these years?" "I think," Daniel said, rising to follow her toward the house, calling out to gather their children for the evening meal, "that some traditions are worth preserving precisely because of what they represent. That first meal you served me changed the entire course of my life, Susanna. I intend to eat rabbit stew at your table for the rest of my days, and count myself the most fortunate man in the territory for the privilege." That evening, as the family gathered around the table Daniel had built himself in the early days of their marriage, Thomas recounting with great animation his day's adventures chasing a jackrabbit through the scrub, Grace interjecting corrections to her brother's clearly embellished account, and Eleanor beginning to stir and fuss with the particular insistence of an infant who has decided it is time to be fed, Daniel looked around at the life he had built, at the woman who had transformed from a warrant in his breast pocket into the very center of his existence, and felt a gratitude so profound it nearly brought tears to his eyes. The warrant that had once threatened to tear Susanna Easton's life apart had instead become the improbable thread that wove her life together with Daniel Whitfield's. Two people brought together by circumstances neither could have predicted, united first by a shared commitment to truth and justice, and ultimately by a love that had proven strong enough to weather fear, danger, and the harsh uncertainties of frontier life, emerging on the other side not merely intact but flourishing. A family built on honesty, courage, and the simple, enduring power of a home where the door was always open to those in need, and where the woman who had once feared discovery above all else now welcomed the world with open arms, secure at last in the knowledge that she was loved, and safe and truly finally home. Years later, when their children had grown and Thomas himself had taken a wife and begun a family of his own on a neighboring parcel of land, Daniel and Susanna would sometimes sit together on that same porch in the evening light, watching grandchildren now play in the yard where their own children had once tossed clumsy lassos at fence posts, and Susanna would occasionally take out an old, water-stained notebook that she had kept all these years, a memento of the husband she had lost and the life that loss had ultimately, through the strangest of paths, led her toward. "Do you think Thomas would be glad," she asked once, many years after that first fateful hearing in Tombstone, "to see how things turned out?" Daniel considered the question seriously, as he always did when Susanna spoke of her first husband, never begrudging the memory but honoring it as part of the woman he loved. "I think," he said finally, "that any man who loved you as much as you've described would want nothing more than to see you happy and safe, surrounded by a family who loves you as you deserve." "I believe he would be glad, Susanna. I believe he would consider his final gift to you, that careful notebook hidden away in his horse's saddlebag, a debt well and truly repaid by the life you've built since." Susanna smiled, tucking the notebook away in the small wooden box where she kept it, alongside other mementos of a past that no longer held any power to frighten her, transformed instead into simply another chapter in the long, rich story of a life that had, against every early indication, turned out to be a profoundly happy one. "I love you, Daniel Whitfield," she said, as the sun set once more over the mountains that had watched over their entire life together, "as much today as I did that evening beside the fire in the desert, perhaps even more, if such a thing is possible." "I believe it is entirely possible," Daniel replied, drawing her close against his side as they had done 10,000 times before and would continue to do for however many years remained to them. "I find I love you a little more with each passing year, Susanna. I suspect I shall go on loving you more and more until the very last breath leaves my body, and even then, I imagine some part of that love will remain, woven into this land, into our children, into every meal you have ever cooked with those hands I fell in love with before I ever understood what falling in love truly meant." And there, on the porch of the home they had built together, surrounded by the fruits of a love that had begun with a warrant and a plate of rabbit stew, and had grown, over the years, into something as vast and enduring as the desert sky above them, Daniel Whitfield and Susanna Easton Whitfield remained, content together, and profoundly, deeply happy, exactly as they would remain for all the years still to come.